The lawyer's office was a symphony of beige and quiet, expensive ticking. It was a room designed to absorb grief, to muffle the raw, messy sounds of loss into a manageable hum. But it couldn't absorb the shock. I sat on a stiff leather chair, the formal black dress I'd worn to my father's funeral feeling like a costume, and I listened as Mr. Albright, a man who had known our family for 30 years, read my father's last will and testament. And with a few simple, brutally clear sentences, he erased me from my own life. Everything, the house I grew up in, the modest but comfortable investment portfolio, every photograph, every piece of furniture, every memory captured in physical form, was left to my brother, Daniel. My name was mentioned only once, in a clause that felt like a slap from beyond the grave. "To my daughter Sarah," the lawyer read, his eyes refusing to meet mine. "I leave the sum of $1 in the hopes that she might one day understand the true meaning of family and duty." The silence that followed was a living thing. My brother, sitting next to me, had the decency to look down at his hands, a perfect performance of humble surprise. My mother, a fragile bird in a black veil, reached over and squeezed my arm, a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt like a plea for my silence. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. A strange, cold clarity washed over me. This was not a surprise. It was a sentencing. And the trial had happened a year ago. It had happened in our family's living room, a room that had always been a stage for my father's quiet, suffocating brand of tyranny. He had been diagnosed with a degenerative illness, a slow, cruel disease that would eventually steal his mobility and his independence. My mother, my brother, and I were gathered for a family meeting. My father, his voice still strong, laid out his expectations. He did not want to go into a home. He did not want strangers caring for him. My mother, with her own health problems, couldn't do it alone. Daniel, he explained, had his own young family and a demanding job. The responsibility, therefore, was mine. "You're single," my father had said. The word's not a request, but a statement of fact. "Your job is flexible. You will move back home, and you will be his primary caregiver." It wasn't a discussion. It was a decree. I looked at my father, a man whose love had always been a series of transactions and corrections, a man who had spent my entire life making me feel that I was perpetually falling short of an invisible standard. His abuse wasn't the loud, cinematic kind. It was a quiet, relentless erosion of the soul. He would correct my posture in front of my friends, dismissed my achievements with a, "That's nice, but," and pit me and my brother against each other in a silent, lifelong competition for an affection he dispensed like a miser. The thought of becoming his nurse, of being trapped in that house under the absolute authority of his illness, was a vision of hell. "No," I said, the word a small, quiet stone dropped into a deep well. "I won't." I told them I would help. I would contribute financially. I would find the best professional in-home care. I would manage his appointments. I would do anything. But I would not give up my life, my career, my sanity to become his 24-hour servant. My mother had wept. My brother had looked at me with a cool, disappointed judgment. My father had just stared at me, his eyes as cold and hard as granite. "I see," was all he said. "The choice is yours." A few days later, Daniel called a family meeting of his own, without me. He, the golden child, the one who had always known how to play the game, announced that he would step up, that he would find a way to manage his father's care, to take on the burden his sister had refused. He was the hero, and I was cast, permanently, as the selfish, ungrateful daughter. The shunning was immediate and absolute. My calls to my parents went unanswered. My visits were met with a cold, polite wall of silence. I was an outcast, a ghost haunting the edges of my own family. And now, in this beige, airless room, my exile was made official. I had been disinherited, not just from my father's money, but from his memory, from my own past. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. I didn't look at my mother or my brother. I said to the lawyer, "I understand." My voice was a dead, flat thing, and I walked out. I walked out of the office, out of the building, and into the cold, indifferent city. The $1, the single symbolic coin of my worth, felt heavier than the entire weight of the inheritance I had just lost. The story was perfect. The selfish daughter had been punished. The dutiful son had been rewarded. But as I walked, a single, burning question began to form in the cold, clear space of my anger. Why was the punishment so absolute? It felt like more than just a father's bitter revenge. It felt like a payment. It felt like a transaction. And I had a sudden, terrifying feeling that the story everyone believed was a lie, and that my brother was not the hero. He was the one who had written the final, brutal chapter. The funeral was a week later, and it was the most surreal performance I had ever attended. I stood in the receiving line, a ghost in a black dress, as a parade of my parents' friends and distant relatives offered me their condolences. Their eyes were full of a gentle, pitying sadness, but I knew what they all were thinking. They had all heard the story. I was the daughter who had abandoned her dying father. They would pat my hand and say, "Your brother is such a good man. Your parents are so lucky to have him." Each word was a small, sharp twist of the knife. Daniel was magnificent. He moved through the crowd, his face a perfect, tragic mask of grief and quiet strength. He was the grieving son, the stoic caregiver, the new patriarch of our broken family. He had inherited not just my father's money, but his mantle of quiet, unassailable authority. He would occasionally catch my eye, a flicker of something, triumph, pity, in his gaze, before it was gone. My mother was a specter, floating through the rooms, held up by the arm of her heroic son. She wouldn't look at me. Her grief was a wall between us, a wall that I now knew was built of more than just the loss of her husband. I knew I couldn't let it go. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a constant, burning pressure in my chest. It wasn't about the money. It was about the truth. It was about the quiet, smug victory on my brother's face. I knew, with a certainty that felt like the only solid thing left in my world, that there was more to the story. My father was a cruel man, but this act of total erasure, this single dollar, it felt like it had been written by a different author. My search for answers began in the one place I knew my father kept his secrets, his home office. It was his sanctuary, a dark, wood-paneled room that had always been off-limits to me. A week after the funeral, I went to the house, using the excuse of needing to pick up some old photo albums from my childhood. My mother, listless and grieving, let me in without a word. Daniel was there, already starting to sort through my father's things, a task he undertook with a solemn, proprietary air. "The office is a mess," he said, blocking the doorway slightly. "I'll go through everything and let you know if there's anything you might want." "That's okay. I just want to look for one thing." I pushed past him, my heart pounding. I was trespassing in my own past. The office was exactly as he had left it, a fortress of order and control. I didn't know what I was looking for. A letter? A different will? I started with his desk, a massive oak thing that had always seemed like a judge's bench. The drawers were filled with neat files and financial records. Nothing seemed out of place. But I remembered something from my childhood. My father had a habit of keeping important things not in the main drawers, but in a hidden compartment. It was a game he used to play with me, a secret agent game, a memory from a time before he had decided I was a disappointment. I ran my hand along the inside of the knee hole of the desk, searching for the small, almost invisible latch. I found it. A small section of the wood clicked open, revealing a shallow, hidden drawer. My brother, who was watching me from the doorway with a frown, took a sharp breath. He had clearly not known about this. The drawer contained a single, thin file folder, and inside that folder was the truth. It wasn't a different will. It was something far darker. The first thing I saw was a yellowed newspaper clipping, dated 25 years ago. The headline read, "Local teacher killed in hit and run. Police seek witnesses." The story described a tragic accident on a rainy night. A young woman struck and killed by a driver who had fled the scene. The case was never solved. My blood ran cold. Why would my father have this? And then I saw the other document in the folder. It was a letter written in my father's precise, controlled handwriting. It was not addressed to anyone. It was a confession. He had been the driver. He wrote about the rainy night, the slick roads, the terrible, sickening thud. He wrote about his panic, his cowardice, the decision to drive away that had haunted him for the rest of his life. He had been a young man, on the verge of a major promotion, and a scandal would have destroyed him. So he had buried his secret, and he had lived with the ghost of what he had done for a quarter of a century. This was the man whose reputation was everything. This was the secret that had held the key to his entire life. But it didn't explain the will. It didn't explain my brother. And then I saw the final papers in the folder. They were bank statements from a separate, private account I had never known about. And they showed a series of large, regular monthly transfers. The transfers had started about a year ago, right after our family meeting, and they were all going to one person, my brother. Each transaction was labeled with a single damning word: support. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening, horrifying finality. Daniel had found the secret. He must have stumbled upon it, just as I had. But he hadn't used it to seek justice for the dead woman. He had used it as a weapon. He had used it to blackmail his own father. His stepping up to be the caregiver wasn't an act of duty, it was a power play. He had gone to our father with his discovery, and he had made him a deal. He would keep the secret, a secret that would have destroyed our father's reputation and possibly sent him to prison. He would even take on the burden of his care. And in return, he wanted everything. He didn't just want the money. He wanted me erased. He wanted to be the sole undisputed heir to the kingdom. My disinheritance wasn't my father's final act of revenge on me. It was the price of my brother's silence. My mother and father hadn't been punishing me. They had been paying a ransom. I looked up from the folder, at my brother, who was still standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his smug composure finally gone, replaced by the cornered, desperate look of a rat. He knew what I had found. He knew the game was over. "You son of a bitch," I whispered, the words full of venom I didn't know I possessed. "You didn't just watch him die. You sold him his own death." I took the folder, closed the secret drawer, and walked past him, leaving him standing alone in the office with the ghosts of his own making. The funeral was over, but I was about to hold a resurrection. And the first thing I was going to bring back to life was the truth. I walked out of that house with the folder clutched in my hand, a cold, hard artifact of my family's ruin. My brother didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, a statue in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief and daunting terror. The power he had held, the terrible secret that had been his leverage, had just been transferred, and he knew, in that moment, that I would not be as merciful as he had been. For a few days, I did nothing. I sat in my small apartment, the file on my coffee table, a ticking bomb in the center of my life. I read the confession over and over, the words of a man I had both feared and, in some complicated way, loved. I looked at the bank statements, at the cold, hard numbers that represented the price of my brother's soul. My grief for my father was a confusing, tangled thing. He was a monster, a man who had left a woman to die on the side of a road. But he was also a victim, a man who had been bled dry by his own son. My anger at my brother was a purer thing. It was a clean, white-hot rage. He had not just blackmailed our father. He had used his father's crime as a tool to destroy me. He had taken my one act of self-preservation, my refusal to be a servant, and he had twisted it into a justification for his— I walked out of that house with a folder clutched in my hand, a cold, hard artifact of my family's ruin. My brother didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, a statue in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning terror. The power he had held, the terrible secret that had been his leverage, had just been transferred. And he knew, in that moment, that I would not be as merciful as he had been. For a few days, I did nothing. I sat in my small apartment, the file on my coffee table, a ticking bomb in the center of my life. I read the confession over and over, the words of a man I had both feared and in some complicated way loved. I looked at the bank statements, at the cold, hard numbers that represented the price of my brother's soul. My grief for my father was a confusing, tangled thing. He was a monster, a man who had left a woman to die on the side of a road. But he was also a victim, a man who had been bled dry by his own son. My anger at my brother was a purer thing. It was a clean, white-hot rage. He had not just blackmailed our father, he had used his father's crime as a tool to destroy me. He had taken my one act of self-preservation, my refusal to be a servant, and he had twisted it into a justification for his own greed. He had watched me be ostracized by my own family, knowing the entire time that the story was a lie. He had stood at that funeral, accepting condolences, playing the part of the grieving, dutiful son, all while his pockets were lined with hush money. I knew I had to expose him. But how? If I went to the police with my father's confession, I would be destroying a dead man's reputation and bringing a fresh wave of agony to the family of the woman he had killed. But if I did nothing, Daniel would get away with it. He would inherit everything, and I would be left as the villain in a story he had written. My mother was the key. She was the silent, grieving figure at the center of this tragedy. What did she know? Was she a victim in this too? Or was she a co-conspirator, a woman who had chosen to sacrifice her daughter to protect her husband's secret and her son's ambition? I had to know. I called her. For the first time in a year, she answered. Her voice was a thin, fragile thread. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I know, I said, my voice flat. I know about the hit and run, and I know about the payments to Daniel. The silence on the other end of the line was a confession in itself. I heard a small, choked sob. "I wanted to tell you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I wanted to, but I was so scared." She told me the story. She had known about the accident for years. My father had confessed to her one night, drunk and haunted. The guilt had been a cancer in their marriage, a secret that had made him the cold, distant man he was. When Daniel had discovered the confession, he had come to them, not as a son, but as a businessman making a deal. He had laid out his terms. He would keep the secret. He would protect his father's legacy. And in return, he wanted to be the sole heir, and he wanted me, the daughter who had always been a quiet challenge to her father's authority, to be completely and utterly cut out. "Why?" I asked, the word a raw, open wound. "Why would you agree to that? Why would you let him do that to me?" "Because your father was a coward," she said, and for the first time I heard a flicker of steel in her voice. He was so terrified of the world knowing what he had done that he was willing to sacrifice anything, anyone, to protect his reputation. And I was a coward too. I was so used to keeping his secrets, to living in his shadow, that I didn't know how to fight back. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I am so, so sorry." Her apology was a small, cracked window in the prison of my anger. She was not my enemy. She was a fellow prisoner, a woman who had been trapped in the same cage for much longer than I had. But her apology wasn't enough. It couldn't undo the will. It couldn't erase the lie. The funeral itself was a week in the past, but in our small town, the rituals of grief continued. The final piece was the memorial service, a more public affair to be held at the community church that weekend, followed by a reception. It was meant to be a celebration of my father's life, a final sealing of his public legacy as a respected community member. It was to be Daniel's first official act as the new head of the family, a chance for him to stand before the town and accept their sympathies. It was his coronation, and I decided it would be his execution. The plan was simple, it was terrifying, and it was the only way. I made copies of everything: the confession, the bank statements. I put them in a series of envelopes. I spent the week preparing, my grief and my anger sharpening into a single clear point of purpose. I also made one phone call. I found the phone number for the family of the woman who had been killed, the woman from the newspaper clipping. I spoke to her younger sister. I told her I had some information about her unsolved case and that the truth would be revealed at the memorial service for a man named Charles Miller. I didn't give her details. I just told her to be there. The day of the memorial, the church was packed. It was a sea of familiar faces, the entire tapestry of my parents' life. I sat in the front pew with my mother and brother, a perfect, broken portrait of a grieving family. Daniel was the star of the show. He gave the eulogy. It was a masterpiece of loving hypocrisy. He spoke of our father's integrity, his sense of duty, his deep love for his family. He even mentioned me, his voice thick with a sorrowful, patronizing forgiveness. And to my sister, Sarah, "I know you and Dad had your differences, but I want you to know that he loved you, and I love you, and there will always be a place for you in this family." The crowd was moved. I saw people dabbing at their eyes. He was a saint, a forgiving, noble son. After the service, we moved to the reception hall next door. It was a somber, catered affair. People milled about, sharing memories, offering condolences. This was the moment. Daniel was standing by the podium, preparing to say a few final words of thanks. He was at the height of his power, surrounded by the admiration and sympathy of his entire world. I walked up to the podium. He saw me coming, a flash of annoyance in his eyes. "Sarah, this isn't the time," he whispered. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm here to share one final memory of Dad, something I think he would have wanted everyone to know." Before he could stop me, I was at the microphone. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at me, the prodigal daughter. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice clear and steady. "My brother spoke of my father's integrity and his sense of duty, and he was a man who believed in paying his debts. There is just one final debt that was left outstanding, and I'm here today to settle the account on his behalf." I reached into my purse and took out the envelopes. "My father was a man who kept records," I said, "and he left behind a final record, a confession of sorts, that explains a great deal. It explains a tragedy that happened in this town 25 years ago." I saw a woman in the back of the room, a woman I had never met, go rigid. It was the sister. "And it explains the will that has left my brother with everything, and me with nothing. You see, the two things are connected.
My brother, Daniel, did not inherit this family's legacy because of his duty. He inherited it because he discovered our father's darkest secret, and he used it to blackmail a dying man. A collective gasp went through the room. Daniel was staring at me, his face white with a mixture of rage and panic. "She's lying," he shouted. "She's hysterical. She's just angry about the will." "Am I?" said, my voice calm. I opened the first envelope. "This," I said, holding up a copy of the confession, "is my father's own account of the night he killed a young woman in a hit-and-run and drove away. Perhaps our town's former chief of police, who is standing right over there, would be interested in reading it." I then opened the second envelope. "And these," I said, holding up the bank statements, "are the records of the monthly payments my brother has been extorting from our father for the past year, the price of his silence, the price of my disinheritance." I didn't need to say another word. I placed the documents on the podium. The story was told. The silence in the room was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket of shock and horror. The hero, the noble son, was a blackmailer. The revered patriarch was a killer. The perfect family was a lie. I had not just exposed my brother, I had detonated a bomb in the heart of my own history, and the fallout was going to be total. The aftermath was a maelstrom. The reception hall, once a place of quiet grief, became a chaotic scene of whispered accusations and horrified stares. I didn't stay to watch the full implosion. I had lit the fuse, and I knew the bomb would do its work. I walked through the stunned, silent crowd, my eyes fixed on the exit. As I passed the woman I had called, the sister of the victim, I saw her pick up the confession from the podium, her hands shaking. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, a silent, devastating acknowledgement of a justice too long delayed. I walked out into the cold air, leaving the wreckage of my family's reputation behind me. The sense of relief was so profound it almost buckled my knees. The weight I had been carrying, the injustice of the lie, was finally gone. I hadn't just reclaimed my own story, I had given a voice to a woman who had been silenced for a quarter of a century. The scandal that erupted in our small town was biblical in its scope. The story was everywhere, pillar of the community's dark secret revealed at his own memorial. The confession, though not legally binding against a dead man, was a moral conviction in the court of public opinion. My father's name, once a symbol of integrity, was now synonymous with cowardice and deceit. The quiet tyranny he had wielded in our home was finally given a public face. But the true inferno was reserved for my brother. He was not just the son of a criminal, he was a ghoul, a man who had feasted on his own family's tragedy. The bank statements were undeniable. He was a blackmailer and an extortionist. His friends, the people who had praised his duty, turned their backs on him. The community that had admired him now looked at him with contempt. He was a pariah, a man whose greed had cost him everything. The will, which had been the source of his triumph, became his curse. He was the sole heir to a name that was now worthless and an estate that was about to be torn apart by legal battles. The family of the victim, armed with the confession, filed a wrongful death suit against my father's estate. It was a long and messy process, but in the end they won. A significant portion of the inheritance, the money Daniel had blackmailed his way into, was awarded to them as damages. What was left was devoured by legal fees. The kingdom my brother had stolen was reduced to a pile of dust and debt. He tried to fight me, of course. He tried to claim I had faked the documents, that I was a vindictive, unstable liar, but the truth had too many witnesses now. My mother, in a final quiet act of redemption, gave a sworn statement to the lawyers, confirming everything. She confirmed the blackmail, the fear, the terrible choices they had made under the pressure of Daniel's greed and her husband's cowardice. She had finally chosen a side. She had chosen her daughter. Our relationship is not what it once was. It is a fragile, tentative thing, a landscape scarred by the secrets she kept. But it is honest. For the first time, we are two women talking to each other, not a mother and a daughter performing their prescribed roles. She sold the house, a place that held too many ghosts, and moved into a smaller, brighter apartment. She is finally free from the shadow of the man she had spent her life protecting. I never saw my brother again. He left town, a disgraced man with nothing to his name. I have no idea where he went, and I have no desire to know. He is a ghost from a life I no longer live. I didn't get the inheritance, I didn't get the house or the money, but I got something far more valuable. I got the truth. The single dollar my father had left me, the symbol of my worthlessness in his eyes, turned out to be the most expensive dollar my brother ever made. It cost him everything, and it gave me back my own name, free and clear of the lies they had tried to bury me under. I am no longer the selfish daughter. I am the one who told the truth. And in the quiet, honest life I have built for myself, That is an inheritance worth more than all the money in the world.